wolf slammed his fist into the stone wall so hard that dust rained down from the ceiling, and every guard in the hall took a step back. Cale Ashgrove did not raise his voice. He never needed to. His silence was worse than any shout, and the young warrior standing before him, still holding a small bundle of wildflowers, understood that his life had just become very short. "Put them down," Cale said quietly. Bastion's hands trembled as he set the flowers on the stone floor. He had only wanted to thank Illyra for healing his shoulder after the border skirmish. He had not expected the king himself to appear in the healing hall like a shadow that had been waiting all along. Illyra stood a few feet away, her hands still stained with herb paste, her heart pounding for reasons she could not explain. She had seen Cale angry before. She had seen him cold, distant, sharp enough to cut. But this was something else. This was a fury that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than pride or rank. "He was only saying thank you," she said, stepping forward before she could stop herself. Cale's gaze snapped to her, and for a moment, the anger in his eyes flickered into something unreadable, something almost wounded. Then it was gone, replaced by the same iron control that had ruled the northern packs for 6 years. "Get back to your work," he told her, and turned to leave without another word. The hall stayed silent long after he was gone. Bastion let out a breath he had been holding, and one of the older guards, a broad-shouldered man named Colton, shook his head slowly. "You're lucky he only broke the wall," Colton muttered. Illyra knelt down and picked up the flowers Bastion had brought her. They were slightly crushed now, their petals bent, but she pressed them carefully between her fingers anyway, as if trying to save something that had already been ruined. "Why does he hate it so much?" she asked, more to herself than to anyone else. "I heal people. That's my only purpose here. Why does he act like I belong to him?" No one answered her, because no one truly knew. Illyra had lived among the wolves of the northern packs for almost a year now, ever since the night her village burned to the ground under a red moon. She still remembered the smell of smoke, the screams that echoed through the trees, the rogue pack that tore through her home like a storm with teeth. She remembered running, until her lungs burned, until she collapsed at the edge of Cale's territory, more dead than alive. She did not remember much of what happened next. She only knew that when she woke, she was inside a warm room with clean bandages on her wounds, and a woman named Ines was sitting beside her, telling her she was safe now, that the Alpha King had ordered her protected. At the time, Illyra had been too broken to ask why a Wolf King would care about the life of one human healer. She had simply been grateful. It was only later, once her strength returned and her skills as a healer became known throughout the pack, that she began to notice how strange her position truly was. She was human, yet she lived inside the royal den. She had no rank, yet no one dared to treat her poorly. She healed wolves who had been Cale's enemies only days before. Wolves from rival packs who came under truce to have their wounds tended, and Cale allowed it, watching from a distance with an expression she could never quite read. But every single time someone showed her kindness, every single time a warrior smiled at her a little too long, or a hunter brought her a gift as thanks, Cale appeared like a storm cloud rolling in from nowhere, and something in the pack shifted, tightened, grew afraid. It made no sense to her. He barely spoke to her himself. He never thanked her for the nights she stayed awake tending his wounded soldiers. He never asked how she was adjusting to a world so different from her own. He simply watched, and when anyone came too close, he struck fear into them until they backed away. She had once believed it was because he saw her as a possession, something valuable that belonged to the pack, and therefore to him. But possessions did not make a king's hands shake with restrained fury. Possessions did not make his voice drop into something low and dangerous whenever her name was mentioned by another man. That evening, after the incident with Bastion, Illyra sat alone in the healing hall, grinding herbs into paste long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The moonlight spilled through the tall windows, painting silver lines across the stone floor. She liked the quiet hours best. They were the only time she did not feel watched. A knock at the door startled her. She looked up to see Ines standing there, wrapped in a thick shawl, her expression careful. "You should be resting," Ines said. "I could say the same to you," Illyra replied, managing a small smile. Ines stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She had been kind to Illyra since the very beginning, one of the few people in the pack who treated her like a person rather than a curiosity or a threat. She sat down across from Alira and studied her for a long moment. "You looked upset earlier," Ines said, after the king left. Alira set down the herbs she had been grinding and rubbed her tired eyes. "I don't understand him. I never have. He saved my life, and I'm grateful, truly. But he treats me like a prisoner sometimes, without ever explaining why. I can't have a simple conversation with anyone without him appearing out of nowhere, like I've done something wrong." Ines was quiet for a moment, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. "Wolves are not like humans," she finally said. "Some bonds run deeper than friendship or duty. Sometimes a wolf feels a pull toward another person that they cannot explain, cannot control, and cannot ignore, even if they wanted to." "What does that mean?" Alira asked, sitting up straighter. "It means," Ines said carefully, "that you should ask him yourself, someday, when you're ready to hear the answer. It's not my place to say more." Alira wanted to press further, but something in Enes's expression told her the conversation was over. She let it go, though the words stayed with her long after Ines left the room, circling through her mind like smoke that refused to clear. The next few days passed in their usual rhythm. Alira tended to the sick and the wounded, walked the herb gardens at dawn, and did her best to avoid situations that might draw Cale's anger. But avoiding him was almost impossible. He was the Alpha King. His presence filled every hall, every gathering, every corner of the territory, whether he was physically there or not. She noticed things she had never paid attention to before. The way the guards outside her door changed shifts more often than necessary, always watching. The way certain warriors, ones who might have once flirted freely with a pretty healer, now kept a careful, respectful distance, as if an invisible line had been drawn around her that everyone understood except her. One afternoon, while she was collecting herbs near the eastern edge of the territory, she met a young trader named Callum who had come from a neighboring village to sell supplies. He was friendly and easy to talk to, asking simple questions about the herbs she gathered, laughing at her jokes, treating her like an ordinary woman rather than something fragile or forbidden. For the first time in a long while, Alira felt normal. She felt like herself again, the woman she had been before her village burned, before she became a healer, living under the protection of a king who barely spoke to her. Then Cale arrived. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply appeared at the edge of the clearing, his golden eyes fixed on Callum with an intensity that made the trader's easy smile falter instantly. "The trading grounds are on the other side of the river," Cale said, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument. Callum bowed his head quickly, gathered his goods, and left without another word, casting one last apologetic glance at Alira as he went. Alira turned to face Cale, her patience finally cracking. "He was just talking to me, that's all." "Is that a crime now?" Cale's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the clearing, with her basket of herbs and a growing storm of frustration inside her chest. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small room, replaying every strange moment of the past year, every flash of anger in Cale's eyes whenever someone dared to get close to her. She thought about what Ines had said, about bonds that could not be explained or controlled. She thought about the way Cale's eyes lingered on her sometimes, quick and searching, before he caught himself and looked away. She thought about the night she had woken from her injuries to find him standing silently at the edge of her room, watching her sleep, only to vanish the moment she stirred. None of it made sense on its own. But together, the pieces formed a shape she wasn't ready to name. Alira rose before dawn and walked to the training grounds, where she often watched the warriors practice from a safe distance, while gathering morning dew for her remedies. The air was cool and sharp, the sky still painted in soft shades of gray and lavender. She spotted Cale among the warriors, moving through combat drills with a precision that seemed almost effortless. Even from far away, she could see the raw power in his movements, the way every strike carried purpose, the way the other warriors gave him a wide berth out of respect, or perhaps fear. He caught her watching. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the training grounds, and something passed between them that made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't anger this time. It wasn't the cold detachment she had grown used to. It was something raw and unguarded, gone as quickly as it appeared. He looked away first, turning back to his training as if nothing had happened. Alira stood frozen for a long moment, before forcing herself to continue on her way, her mind racing with questions she didn't yet have the courage to ask. Later that day, word spread through the pack that a delegation from a neighboring territory was arriving to discuss trade agreements. Among them was a young leader named Draven, whose reputation for ambition and charm preceded him. Alira paid it little attention at the time. She had no reason to believe the arrival of a stranger would change anything. She was wrong. That evening, during the welcoming feast held in the Great Hall, Alira found herself seated near the edge of the gathering, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid unwanted attention. The hall buzzed with conversation and laughter, warriors exchanging stories, the scent of roasted meat and warm bread filling the air. Draven approached her table with an easy smile, introducing himself with practiced charm. He was handsome in a sharp, calculated way, his golden hair catching the firelight as he spoke. "You must be the healer everyone speaks of," he said, taking a seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. "Kael Ashgrove's territory is fortunate to have someone with your skill." Alira offered a polite smile, though something about the way he studied her made her uneasy. "I do what I can." "Modest," Draven said, his smile widening. "I like that." Across the hall, she felt Kael's gaze land on her like a physical weight. She didn't need to look up to know he was watching, his expression no doubt carved from stone, his patience already stretched thin. Draven seemed to notice it too, and rather than backing away, he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to carry an edge of mischief. "It seems my presence is not entirely welcome," he said, glancing toward Kael with obvious amusement. "Tell me, healer, why does the mighty Alpha King watch you as though you belong to him, yet never claims you as his own?" The question struck deeper than Alira expected, echoing the very confusion that had haunted her for months. She had no answer to give him, because she didn't have one for herself. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. Draven's smile turned thoughtful, calculating in a way she couldn't quite place. "Perhaps it's time someone found out." Before she could respond, a shadow fell over the table. Kael stood there, his presence commanding immediate silence from those nearby. His eyes were fixed on Draven, with a warning so clear it needed no words. "The trade discussions begin at dawn," Kael said, his voice low and controlled, though the tension beneath it was unmistakable. "I suggest you rest, so you're prepared." Draven rose smoothly, unbothered by the implied threat, and offered Alira a small, knowing smile before walking away. "Until tomorrow, healer." Once he was gone, Kael remained standing beside her table, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. Alira looked up at him, exhaustion and frustration finally boiling over into words she had held back for far too long. "You can't keep doing this," she said quietly, though her voice trembled with the weight of everything she had swallowed for months. "You can't keep chasing away every person who shows me a moment of kindness and refuse to tell me why. I deserve an explanation, Kael. I deserve to understand why my life feels like it belongs to you when you've never once claimed it." For a moment, something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like pain. But then it vanished, buried beneath the same unreadable mask he always wore. "Not here," he said quietly, and walked away, before she could argue further, leaving her alone at the table, with her heart pounding, and questions multiplying by the second. She watched him disappear into the crowd, his broad shoulders tense, his steps quick and purposeful, as though he were fleeing something he couldn't outrun. Whatever secret he was hiding, she was determined now more than ever to uncover it. She could feel it, somewhere beneath the anger and the distance, a truth waiting to break free, one that would change everything between them. She just didn't yet know how much. The morning after the feast, the great hall was filled with tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Trade discussions between Kael's territory and Draven's delegation had begun at dawn, exactly as promised, but the air between the two leaders carried none of the polite formality such meetings usually required. Alira was not present for the negotiations, but she heard about them soon enough. Word traveled fast through the pack, carried by warriors and servants alike, each version slightly more dramatic than the last. What she gathered, piecing together the fragments, was that Draven had spent the entire morning finding small ways to mention her, complimenting her skill, asking pointed questions about her role within the territory, watching Kael's reactions with obvious enjoyment. By midday, Kale's patience had worn thin enough that the negotiations ended early, with both sides agreeing to resume the following week instead. Draven's delegation was given quarters on the western side of the territory, close enough that his presence lingered like an unwelcome shadow over everything. Alira spent the day in the healing hall, trying to focus on her work, though her mind kept drifting back to the conversation she had started the night before, the one Kale had cut short with two simple words, "Not here," as if there was somewhere else, some other place where the truth might finally be spoken. She wondered if that place would ever come. In the late afternoon, while she was organizing dried herbs into labeled jars, a familiar knock sounded at her door. She expected Ines, but instead found Draven standing there, his posture relaxed, his expression carrying the same easy charm from the night before. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, stepping inside without quite waiting for permission. Alira set down the jar in her hands, keeping a polite but guarded distance. "I'm quite busy." "Of course," Draven said, glancing around the small room with visible curiosity. "I only wanted to apologize if I caused any trouble for you last night. It wasn't my intention to put you in an uncomfortable position." "Wasn't it?" Alira asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. Draven chuckled softly, the sound smooth and practiced. "Perhaps a little. I admit, I find it fascinating how much power you seem to hold over the Alpha King, without even realizing it yourself." "I don't hold any power over him," Alira said, though even as she spoke the words, she wasn't entirely certain they were true. "That's not what I saw," Draven replied, taking a step closer. "I've dealt with many alphas in my time, Alira. Powerful men who rule with iron control, who never let their emotions slip in front of others. Yet last night, Kale Ashgrove looked at you like a man standing at the edge of losing everything that matters to him. That's not the look of someone who sees you as nothing more than a healer under his protection." Alira's chest tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. "What are you suggesting?" Draven's gaze softened slightly, though the calculating edge never fully left his expression. "I'm suggesting that you deserve honesty, whatever the truth may be, and if Kale refuses to give it to you, perhaps you should consider that there are other places in this world where you might find people willing to treat you with the openness you deserve." Before Alira could respond, the door swung open, and Kale filled the frame, his presence immediate and overwhelming. His eyes moved from Draven to Alira, and though his expression remained controlled, the tightness in his jaw betrayed the storm building beneath the surface. "This meeting is over," Kale said, his voice low and final. Draven offered a small, unbothered bow before making his way toward the door, pausing only briefly beside Kale. "Something to consider, Alpha King. Secrets have a way of costing more than the truth ever could." Once Draven was gone, silence settled heavily between Kale and Alira, the kind of silence that seemed to hum with everything left unspoken. Alira crossed her arms, refusing to be the one to break it first this time. Kale finally spoke, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "Stay away from him." "Why?" she asked. "You still haven't given me a single reason for any of this, Kale. Not for him, not for Bastion, not for anyone. You just appear, you scare people away, and then you disappear again without a word." "I'm tired of it." "It's not that simple," he said, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Then make it simple," she snapped, her frustration finally breaking through the careful composure she had maintained for so long. "Explain it to me, please. I've spent a year here, grateful for the protection you gave me, grateful for the home you allowed me to build within these walls, but I can't keep living like this, surrounded by rules I don't understand, watched by a man who won't tell me why." Kale was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. She thought, for a moment, that he might finally speak the truth she had been chasing for so long. Instead, he took a step back, his expression closing off once more. "I have matters to attend to," he said, and left the room without another word, leaving Alira standing alone, amid her herbs and jars, her frustration mixing with a growing ache she didn't fully understand. That night, unable to settle her restless thoughts, Alira wandered the quiet corridors of the den, eventually finding herself near the western wing, where Draven's delegation had been housed. She told herself she wasn't looking for him specifically, only needing air, needing space away from her own room, where every wall seemed to echo with unanswered questions. She found Draven sitting alone near an open window, a cup of wine in his hand, his expression thoughtful, as he gazed out at the moonlit forest beyond the territory's borders. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked without turning. Alira hesitated at the doorway, unsure why she had come at all. "I suppose not." Draven gestured toward the empty seat across from him, and after a moment of consideration, she accepted, settling into the chair with a weary sigh. "You seem troubled," Draven observed, studying her with quiet interest. "I'm tired of being kept in the dark about my own life," Alira admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty. Draven nodded slowly, understanding flickering across his features. "There is a bond among wolves," he said carefully. "One that runs deeper than choice or duty. It's called a fated bond. When a wolf finds the person meant to walk beside them for life, something within them recognizes it instantly, undeniably, even if the wolf himself wishes to deny it." Alira's heart began to race. "What does that have to do with Cale?" Draven studied her for a long moment before answering. "I think you already suspect the answer, healer. I think you've suspected it for quite some time, even if you haven't allowed yourself to fully believe it." The words settled over her like a weight she wasn't prepared to carry, stirring memories of Cale's strange, unexplained anger, his lingering gazes, the way his composure seemed to crack only around her. She thought of Inez's careful words from days before, about bonds that could not be explained or ignored. "Why wouldn't he tell me?" she whispered, more to herself than to Draven. "Perhaps he's afraid," Draven suggested. "Fear can make even the strongest alphas behave in ways that seem cruel or confusing to those who don't understand the reason behind it. Or perhaps," he added, his tone shifting slightly, "he simply doesn't believe you deserve to know the truth about your own life." Alira frowned at the sudden edge in his voice, sensing something beneath his words that felt less like concern and more like strategy, though she couldn't quite name what it was. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed down the corridor, and moments later Cale appeared in the doorway, his expression darker than she had ever seen it. His eyes moved between her and Draven with a fury so intense it seemed to fill the entire room. "Alira," he said, his voice tight with restraint, "come with me." She hesitated, torn between her frustration with him and the strange pull she couldn't quite explain. But something in his eyes, some desperate plea hidden beneath the anger, convinced her to rise from her seat. As she passed him in the doorway, he caught her arm gently, his touch far softer than his expression suggested, and led her away from the western wing in silence. They walked until they reached a quiet balcony, overlooking the moonlit forest, far from prying eyes and listening ears. Cale released her arm and stood at the railing, his back to her, his shoulders tense with something that looked almost like defeat. "You shouldn't trust him," Cale said quietly. "Then give me a reason to trust you instead," Alira replied, stepping closer. "Tell me the truth, Cale. All of it. I'm done guessing." He turned to face her, moonlight catching the golden color of his eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something other than control reflected there. She saw fear. "If I tell you," he said slowly, "everything changes. And I don't know if you're ready for that." "Let me decide that for myself," she said softly. Cale studied her for a long, silent moment, the weight of his next words seeming to hang between them like the edge of a cliff. Neither of them was ready to step off of yet. "Soon," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promise you, soon." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but something in his eyes told her it was the truth, at least for now. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that the walls between them were finally beginning to crack. Days passed, and the promise Cale had made on the balcony lingered in the air between them like an unfinished sentence. He did not withdraw it, but he did not fulfill it either. And Alira found herself caught in a strange in-between place, no longer content with silence, yet unwilling to push him past the point where he might close off entirely. The trade negotiations with Draven's delegation resumed, and though Cale remained composed during official meetings, Alira noticed the toll it took on him. He grew quieter at meals, more withdrawn during training, his eyes shadowed with the weight of something he refused to name aloud. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but she didn't know how, not when so much still stood unexplained between them. Draven, meanwhile, seemed to grow bolder with each passing day. He found reasons to linger near the healing hall, offering compliments and casual conversation whenever Alira was present, always careful to frame his attention as harmless curiosity rather than open pursuit. Yet Alira could sense something calculated beneath his charm, something that made her cautious, even as she found herself drawn into conversation with him more than once, if only because he offered answers where Cale offered silence. One afternoon, while gathering supplies near the edge of the territory, Alira encountered a young girl named Bree, no older than 8, crying beside a fallen tree. Her ankle was twisted, tears streaking down her dirt-smudged face as she tried and failed to stand. Alira knelt beside her immediately, examining the injury with practiced hands. "It's all right," she said gently. "I'm going to help you. Can you tell me your name?" "Bree," the girl sniffled. "I was chasing a rabbit and I fell." "Well, Bree, you're very brave," Alira said, offering a reassuring smile, as she carefully wrapped the girl's ankle with strips of cloth from her healing kit. "This will help until we get you home." As she worked, she noticed a figure approaching from the tree line. Her heart skipped, half expecting Cale's familiar tension to fill the air, but instead she recognized one of the pack's younger warriors, a gentle soul named Finn, who often helped tend the territory's youngest members. "Bree," Finn said with obvious relief, kneeling beside them. "Your mother is worried sick, thank you," he added, glancing at Alira with genuine gratitude for helping her. "Of course," Alira replied, finishing the last of the wrap. "She'll need to rest it for a few days, but she'll be just fine." Finn gently lifted Bree into his arms, the young girl already looking more at ease despite her tears. As they turned to leave, Bree looked back at Alira with a small, grateful smile. "Thank you for fixing me," she said softly. Alira's heart warmed at the simple gratitude. So different from the calculated compliments she had grown used to from Draven, so different from the careful distance most adults kept around her out of fear of Cale's temper. It reminded her of why she had chosen to become a healer in the first place, long before her village burned, long before wolves and fated bonds and unspoken secrets had entered her life. She watched Finn carry Bree back toward the den, a warm feeling settling in her chest, only to freeze the moment she turned and found Cale standing several feet away, watching the entire scene unfold in silence. She braced herself for the familiar tension, the cold anger that usually followed whenever someone showed her kindness. But this time, something different colored his expression. There was no anger in his eyes, only something quiet and thoughtful, almost gentle. "You're good with children," he said softly, breaking the silence between them. Alira blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected warmth in his voice. "I suppose I am," she replied carefully. "It's strange. You're not angry." Something flickered across his face, something like guilt. "I know I haven't been fair to you," he admitted, his voice low. "I know my behavior has confused and hurt you, and for that, I'm sorry." It was the first genuine apology she had ever received from him, and it caught her entirely off guard. She studied him carefully, searching for the walls she had grown used to seeing, but for once, they seemed to have lowered, if only slightly. "Walk with me," Cale said, gesturing toward the forest path that wound along the edge of the territory. Alira hesitated only a moment before agreeing, falling into step beside him as they made their way beneath the tall pines, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the forest floor. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable in a way it had never been before. "When I was young," Cale finally said, breaking the quiet, "my father told me that an alpha's greatest weakness is attachment. He believed love made a leader vulnerable, easy to manipulate, easy to break. I spent my entire life trying to embody that belief, keeping myself distant from anything that might threaten my control." Alira listened carefully, sensing the importance of what he was sharing, even if she didn't yet understand where it was leading. "When my father died and I became Alpha King," Cale continued, "I promised myself I would rule with the same discipline he taught me. No attachments, no vulnerabilities, just strength and control." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "And then you arrived." Her heart pounded at his words, though she remained silent, afraid that speaking might break whatever fragile honesty had settled over him. "From the moment I found you at the edge of my territory, broken and barely breathing, something in me shifted," he continued. "I told myself it was simple compassion, the duty of a king to protect those within his lands. But as the months passed, and I watched you heal, watched you grow stronger, watched you build a life within these walls, I realized it was something far more complicated than compassion. Elira's breath caught in her throat. What are you saying, Cale? He stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. I'm saying that everything my father taught me about attachment being weakness was proven true the moment you arrived, because I have never felt more vulnerable in my entire life than I do standing here in front of you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning she was only beginning to understand. She wanted to ask him outright, to demand the full truth he had promised her days before, but something in his eyes told her he wasn't quite ready to say the words directly, not yet. Cale, she said softly, why does it hurt you so much when others show me kindness? He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with the effort of holding something back. Because every time someone else earns your smile, your laughter, your trust, I feel as though I'm losing something I never had the courage to claim in the first place. Her heart ached at the raw honesty in his words, at the years of restraint and fear that seemed to weigh so heavily on him. She reached out, gently placing her hand over his, feeling the tension in his muscles beneath her fingertips. You don't have to carry this alone, she said softly. For a moment, she thought he might finally tell her everything, the full truth he had been guarding so carefully. But then his gaze shifted past her, toward the tree line, and his expression hardened instantly. We should head back, he said abruptly, pulling away from her touch. It's getting late. Elira turned to see what had caught his attention, and spotted a figure disappearing into the shadows of the forest, too far away to identify clearly, though something about the movement felt deliberate, as though they had been watched the entire time. Cale, what's wrong? She asked, concern creeping into her voice. Nothing, he said, though the tension in his shoulders suggested otherwise. Let's go. They walked back toward the den in silence, the earlier warmth between them, replaced by a cautious unease that Elira couldn't quite shake. Whatever secret Cale carried, it seemed to be tangled with more than just his own fears. Something, or someone, was watching them, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their fragile progress had just become far more complicated than before. That night, long after the den had settled into quiet, Elira lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every word Cale had spoken that afternoon. She thought about fated bonds, about vulnerability and fear, about the way his walls had cracked open just enough to show her something real for the first time. She didn't yet have all the answers, but for the first time since arriving in this world of wolves and secrets, she felt as though she was finally standing on the edge of the truth, close enough to almost touch it. Whatever waited on the other side, she was determined to face it, no matter how much it might change everything she thought she understood about her life, and about the guarded king who had saved her, without ever explaining why. The following morning brought unwelcome news. A scout named Rowan returned from patrol, with word that a group of unfamiliar wolves had been spotted near the eastern border, moving in patterns that suggested they were mapping the territory rather than simply passing through. Cale called an immediate meeting with his senior warriors, and Elira watched from a distance as the mood within the den shifted from cautious peace to quiet alertness. She tried to focus on her work, tending to the usual collection of minor injuries and illnesses that filled her days, but her mind kept drifting back to the conversation on the forest path, to the shadow that had disappeared into the trees just as Cale began to open up to her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the two events were connected somehow, though she had no proof beyond instinct. Later that day, she sought out Ines, hoping for guidance now that Cale himself had begun, however hesitantly, to share the truth. He told me about fated bonds, Elira said quietly, once they were alone in the herb garden, the afternoon sun warm against their skin. Ines's expression softened with understanding, though she didn't seem surprised. I wondered how long it would take him to find the courage. He didn't say it outright, Elira admitted, but I think he was trying to tell me that I might be his. You are, Ines said simply, her voice gentle but certain. Everyone in the pack has known for months. It's the reason behind everything you've witnessed, the anger, the distance, the way he watches you as though the world might end if he looks away for even a moment. Elira absorbed this, her chest tightening with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. Why didn't anyone tell me sooner? Because it wasn't our truth to share, Ines said. Fated bonds are sacred among our kind. It is the Alpha's right, and burden, to reveal it in his own time, in his own way. Kale has spent years believing that attachment makes him weak, that claiming you would put you in danger, or worse, that you would resent being bound to a life you never chose. That's not fair to either of us, Illyra said, frustration creeping into her voice. He's been punishing us both for something neither of us asked for. I know, Ines said softly, but fear rarely listens to fairness. Give him time, Illyra. He's trying, in his own way, to find the courage to be honest with you, and with himself. Illyra nodded slowly, though the ache of frustration lingered beneath her understanding. She thought of Draven's earlier words, about secrets costing more than truth ever could, and wondered how much longer she could wait for Kale to find that courage, before the weight of unspoken things drove them further apart instead of closer together. That evening, the pack gathered for a communal meal in the Great Hall, the mood still tinged with the unease brought on by the scouting report from the eastern border. Kale sat at the head of the long table, his expression carefully composed, though Illyra could see the tension coiled beneath his calm exterior. Draven's delegation was present as well, and though the trade negotiations had officially concluded that afternoon, Draven himself lingered, claiming he wished to enjoy the pack's hospitality one final evening, before departing the following morning. Illyra found herself seated closer to Kale than usual, a small but deliberate shift she suspected Ines had arranged. Throughout the meal, she noticed Kale's occasional glances toward her, quick and searching, though he no longer looked away the moment their eyes met. Something between them had shifted since their conversation on the forest path, subtle but undeniable. Toward the end of the meal, Draven rose to offer a final toast, his golden eyes sweeping across the gathered pack with practiced charm. To new alliances, he said, raising his cup, and to truths, finally coming to light. The words carried a pointed edge that made Illyra's stomach twist with unease. She glanced at Kale, whose jaw had tightened noticeably, his gaze fixed on Draven with barely restrained suspicion. After the toast, as the gathering began to disperse, Draven approached Illyra's table once more, his expression carrying a seriousness she hadn't seen from him before. A word, healer, he said quietly, before I depart. Illyra hesitated, glancing toward Kale, who was engaged in a tense conversation with one of his senior warriors across the hall. She excused herself and followed Draven to a quieter corner of the room. I leave at dawn, Draven said, but before I go, I feel it only fair to warn you of something. Warn me? Illyra asked, wary. The scouts spotted near the eastern border, Draven said, lowering his voice further. They were not simply passing through, as Kale's warriors believe. I have reason to suspect they were sent by a rival faction within my own territory, wolves who oppose the alliance I hope to build with Kale's pack, and who see the fated bond between you and the Alpha King as a threat to be eliminated, before it can be formally claimed. Illyra's blood ran cold. Why would anyone want to harm me? Because a claimed fated mate strengthens an Alpha's position immeasurably, Draven explained. It solidifies loyalty, deepens the pack's bond to their king, and in matters of territory and power, that kind of strength cannot be underestimated. There are those who would rather see the bond broken before it's ever acknowledged, than allow Kale Ashgrove to become even more formidable than he already is. Why are you telling me this? Illyra asked, studying him carefully, uncertain how much of his concern to trust, given his own complicated motivations. Draven's expression grew unexpectedly earnest. Because whatever games I may play, whatever ambitions I hold for my own territory, I have no interest in seeing an innocent woman harmed over politics she never chose to be part of. Be careful, Illyra. Trust carefully in the days ahead. Before she could respond, Kale appeared beside them, his expression darkening the moment he registered the seriousness of their conversation. What's happening here? Draven met his gaze evenly. Simply offering a warning, Alpha King, out of respect for an alliance I still hope we can build, despite our differences. The threat near your eastern border is not what your scouts believe it to be. I suggest you investigate further, and quickly. With that, Draven offered a final bow and departed, leaving Kale and Illyra standing together in tense silence. What did he tell you? Kale asked, his voice low and urgent. Alira relayed Draven's warning as carefully as she could remember it, watching Cale's expression shift from confusion to alarm to something colder and more determined. "I need to speak with my scouts immediately," he said, though he hesitated before leaving, turning back to face her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Stay close to the den tonight, please." "Cale, what's going on?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice for the first time. He reached out, gently cupping her face with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the urgency in his eyes. "I promise I will explain everything, Alira. All of it. But right now, I need to make sure you're safe first." Before she could respond, he was gone, moving quickly through the hall with a sense of purpose that sent a ripple of unease through everyone he passed. Alira stood alone, her heart pounding, Draven's warning echoing through her mind, alongside the memory of Cale's hand against her cheek, gentle, despite the storm building around them. Whatever threat loomed on the horizon, she realized with sudden clarity that she was no longer simply a healer caught in the middle of political games. She was, whether she had chosen it or not, at the very center of something far larger and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The fated bond that had shaped every strange, unexplained moment of the past year was no longer just a private secret between her and Cale. It had become a target, and she could only hope that whatever truth still remained unspoken between them would come to light before it was too late to matter. Cale did not return to the den until well past midnight. Alira waited in the healing hall, unable to sleep, her mind cycling through every possible danger Draven's warning might have hinted at. When Cale finally appeared in the doorway, his expression grim, she rose immediately from her seat. "What did you find?" she asked. "The scouts confirmed it," Cale said, closing the door behind him. "The wolves near the eastern border were not simply scouting territory. They were tracking movement patterns within the den, watching who came and went and how closely you were guarded." Alira's stomach twisted with unease. So Draven was telling the truth. "It seems so," Cale admitted, though his tone carried little relief at the confirmation, "which means the danger is real, and closer than I would like." He crossed the room and sat heavily in the chair across from her, exhaustion visible in the tight lines around his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the night's revelations settling over them both. "I think it's time," Cale finally said, his voice quiet but steady, "that I tell you everything." Alira's heart pounded as she nodded, giving him the space to speak without interruption. "The bond between us," Cale began, choosing his words carefully, "is not something either of us chose. It formed the moment I found you at the edge of my territory, broken and barely alive. Wolves believe that fate chooses certain pairs, souls meant to walk together through life, bound by something stronger than choice or circumstance. I felt it the instant I found you, a pull unlike anything I had ever experienced, undeniable and immediate." He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I told myself it was simply concern for an injured stranger, but as the weeks passed and I watched you heal, watched you build a life within these walls, the pull only grew stronger. I recognized it eventually for what it was. You are my fated mate, Alira." The words, finally spoken aloud, settled over her with a strange mixture of relief and overwhelming uncertainty. She had suspected it for days now, pieced together through Enos's careful hints and Draven's pointed observations, but hearing it directly from Cale carried a different weight entirely. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked softly. "Because I was afraid," Cale admitted, his voice raw with an honesty she had never heard from him before. "Afraid that if I told you the truth, you would feel trapped, forced into a life and a world you never chose for yourself. You lost everything the night your village burned. I couldn't bear the thought of taking away your freedom to choose your own path as well, simply because fate decided our lives should be intertwined." Alira absorbed his words carefully, understanding the fear behind his silence, even as frustration lingered at the months of confusion it had caused. "So instead, you pushed everyone away who came near me, without ever explaining why." "I know it wasn't fair," Cale said. "Every time someone else earned a smile from you, a laugh, a moment of genuine connection, I felt as though I was watching the life I secretly wanted for us slip further away, a life I never gave myself permission to claim. My jealousy was never about controlling you, Alira. It was about fear. Fear of losing something I had never been brave enough to fight for in the first place. Tears welled in her eyes, though she wasn't entirely certain if they came from relief, understanding, or lingering hurt over the months of confusion his silence had caused. You should have trusted me with the truth, Cale. I deserved that much, at the very least. You're right, he said softly. And I'm sorry, more than I know how to properly express. For a long moment, silence settled between them, heavy with everything that had finally been spoken aloud. Illyra studied him carefully, searching for the walls that had defined so much of their relationship until now. But for the first time, she found only honesty staring back at her. What happens now? She asked quietly. That depends entirely on you, Cale said. I won't force this bond upon you, Illyra. Fated or not, I want you to choose this. Choose me. Freely and without pressure. If you decide this isn't the life you want, I will respect that, no matter how much it costs me. The vulnerability in his admission moved her deeply, breaking through the last of her lingering frustration. She reached across the space between them, gently taking his hand in hers. I need time, she admitted honestly. This is a lot to understand, a lot to process. But I don't want you to disappear behind those walls again, Cale. Whatever we decide, I want honesty between us from now on. You'll have it, he promised, his fingers tightening gently around hers. Whatever you decide, Illyra, you'll always have my honesty. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the tension of the earlier threats momentarily easing beneath the weight of finally understanding each other. But the danger Draven had warned of still loomed on the horizon, unresolved and growing closer with each passing hour. We still need to address the threat near the border, Illyra said eventually, her mind returning to practical concerns despite the emotional weight of the evening. Cale nodded, his expression hardening once more with the responsibilities of leadership. I've doubled the guard around the den, and stationed additional warriors along the eastern border. Whoever sent those scouts will find it far more difficult to move unnoticed from here forward. Do you think it's connected to Draven somehow? Illyra asked. Possibly, Cale admitted. Though I believe his warning was genuine, Draven has his own ambitions, certainly, but I don't believe he wishes to see either of us harmed. The wolves responsible for the scouting likely belong to a faction within his own territory, one opposed to any alliance that might strengthen my position through a claimed fated bond. So claiming the bond would make me even more of a target, Illyra said, understanding dawning slowly. It's possible, Cale admitted reluctantly, which is part of why I hesitated so long to reveal the truth. I didn't want to place you in greater danger, simply by acknowledging what fate had already decided. Illyra considered this carefully, weighing the fear against the deeper truth that had finally been spoken between them. I don't want to live in fear, Cale. I've already lost one home to violence and destruction. I refuse to let fear dictate the rest of my life as well. Something shifted in Cale's expression, admiration and relief blending together. He studied her with newfound respect. You're stronger than most warriors I've trained beside for years. I've had to be, she said simply. They remained together long into the night, discussing the threat, the bond, and the uncertain path that lay ahead of them both. By the time Illyra finally returned to her room to rest, exhaustion pulling heavily at her limbs, she felt lighter than she had in months, the weight of unanswered questions finally beginning to lift. But even as sleep claimed her, a small, nagging unease lingered at the edge of her thoughts, a quiet warning that the danger surrounding them had only just begun to reveal itself, and that the choice she now faced, whether to claim the bond fate had chosen for her, carried consequences far greater than either she or Cale yet fully understood. Somewhere beyond the safety of the den's walls, forces were already moving, patient and calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the fragile truth that had finally been spoken between the Alpha King and the healer he had hidden his heart from for far too long. In the days that followed, the atmosphere within the den shifted noticeably. Word of the fated bond, though never officially announced, seemed to spread quietly among the pack, carried through knowing glances and softened attitudes toward Illyra. Warriors who had once kept a careful, fearful distance now greeted her with genuine warmth, no longer worried that a simple kindness might provoke their king's wrath. Cale, too, seemed different, lighter somehow, though the underlying tension from the border threat never fully disappeared. He sought her out more often now, sharing meals with her, walking with her through the forest paths in the quiet hours of early evening, allowing her glimpses into the man behind the Alpha King's carefully constructed armor. She learned about his childhood, the harsh lessons his father had instilled in him about strength and control, the weight of responsibility that had settled onto his shoulders far too young when his father passed and the crown fell to him. She learned about the quiet moments of doubt he rarely allowed himself to feel, buried beneath years of discipline and duty. In turn, she shared pieces of her own life before the fire, memories of her village, the family she had lost, the dreams she once held for a simple, peaceful life, as a healer among her own people. Slowly, carefully, they built something new between them, a foundation of honesty that neither had known before. Yet even as their bond deepened, the shadow of the eastern threat never fully lifted. Patrols reported occasional sightings of unfamiliar wolves near the border, always retreating before they could be caught or questioned. The uncertainty gnawed at Cale, evident in the increased security measures he implemented throughout the territory. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after Draven's departure, a messenger arrived at the den bearing urgent news. Cale called an immediate meeting with his senior warriors, and Alira, sensing the gravity of the situation, made her way to the Great Hall despite not being formally invited. She arrived just as the messenger, a young scout named Piers, finished relaying his report, his expression tense with exhaustion from what had clearly been a long, hard ride. "They're gathering near the border in greater numbers," Piers explained. "Not simply scouts anymore. It looks like preparation for something larger." Cale's expression darkened considerably. "Do we know who's leading them?" "Word among the border villages suggests it's a faction opposing Draven's leadership," Piers replied. "They call themselves the Shadowfang, and they've grown bold enough to challenge his authority openly in recent months. It seems they view any alliance between your territories as a direct threat to their ambitions. And they believe striking at us here will weaken that alliance before it fully forms," Cale concluded grimly. The room fell into tense discussion, warriors debating defensive strategies and potential alliances that might help counter the growing threat. Alira listened carefully from the edge of the gathering, her mind racing with the implications of what she was hearing. After the meeting dispersed, she found Cale standing alone near the hall's tall windows, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line, worry etched deeply into his features. "You're afraid," she observed quietly, moving to stand beside him. "I'm afraid for you," he admitted, not bothering to hide the truth any longer. "The Shadowfang faction sees our bond as a threat to their ambitions. If they succeed in striking here, you would be their most likely target." Alira's chest tightened at the confirmation of what she had already begun to suspect. "What can we do?" "I've sent word to Draven, requesting his assistance in containing this threat before it grows any further," Cale said. "Whatever his own ambitions, I believe he understands the danger this faction poses to us both. And if he doesn't help? Then we prepare to defend ourselves alone," Cale said, determination hardening his voice. "I will not let anyone harm you, Alira. Whatever it takes, I will protect you." Alira reached for his hand, drawing strength from the warmth of his touch, even amid the growing uncertainty. "We'll face this together, Cale, whatever comes." Over the following days, the territory buzzed with preparation. Warriors trained with renewed intensity, additional patrols were established along every border, and the den itself was fortified with increased vigilance. Alira found herself drawn into the preparations as well, organizing medical supplies and training a small group of pack members in basic healing techniques, should the worst come to pass. Amid the growing tension, she and Cale found small moments of peace together, stolen hours where the weight of impending danger faded, if only briefly, beneath the warmth of their deepening connection. He taught her simple defensive techniques during quiet evenings, his hands guiding hers with patient care as she learned to protect herself should the need ever arise. "You're a natural," he said one evening, genuine admiration coloring his voice as she successfully executed a defensive maneuver he had shown her only moments before. "I had a good teacher," she replied, smiling, despite the underlying seriousness of their training. He studied her for a long moment, something soft and unguarded settling over his expression. "Alira, whatever happens with the Shadowfang, I need you to know something." "What is it?" she asked, sensing the shift in his tone. "I love you," he said simply. the words carrying the full weight of everything they had built together over the past weeks. Not because fate chose you for me, but because of who you are, the strength and kindness you've shown despite everything you've lost. I should have told you sooner. Tears welled in her eyes, joy and fear intertwining as she processed the depth of his declaration. I love you too, Kale. I have for longer than I realized, I think. He pulled her close, and for a moment, the looming threat of the Shadowfang faded into the background, replaced by the simple, undeniable truth of the bond they had finally allowed themselves to fully claim. But the peace was short-lived. Later that same night, a horn sounded from the eastern watchtower, its urgent call echoing through the territory, signaling an approaching threat. Kale pulled away instantly, his expression shifting into the hardened focus of a warrior king preparing for battle. Stay here, he instructed, though his eyes carried a silent apology for the abruptness of the moment. Ines will keep you safe, within the den's inner walls. Kale. Please, he said, cupping her face gently, despite the urgency in his voice. I need to know you're safe. I'll come back to you, I promise. Before she could argue further, he was gone, moving quickly to join his warriors, as they prepared to defend the territory's borders. Illyra stood alone in the training grounds, her heart pounding with fear for the man she had finally allowed herself to love completely, uncertain of what the coming hours would bring, but determined, whatever happened, to find a way to help protect the home and the future they had only just begun to build together. Illyra did not stay behind as instructed, not entirely. While Ines guided the youngest pack members and elderly residents toward the safety of the inner chambers, Illyra gathered her healing supplies and made her way toward the outer courtyard, where wounded warriors would inevitably be brought once the confrontation began. The night air was thick with tension, torches casting flickering shadows across the stone walls as warriors moved with practiced efficiency, taking up defensive positions along the territory's perimeter. Illyra set up a makeshift healing station near the courtyard's edge, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. The sounds of the confrontation reached her first, distant at first, then growing steadily closer. She caught glimpses of movement at the tree line, shadows shifting and clashing in the moonlight, though the darkness made it difficult to discern the full scope of what was happening. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she waited, tending to the first wounded warriors who stumbled back from the border, their injuries requiring quick, careful attention. She worked methodically, drawing on every skill she had developed over the past year, grateful for the steady focus her training provided amid the chaos surrounding her. How is it looking? She asked one of the warriors, a young man named Silas, as she wrapped a wound along his forearm. They're pushing hard, Silas admitted, wincing slightly as she secured the bandage. But Kale's holding the line. The Shadowfang didn't expect us to be so well prepared. Relief flickered through her at the news, though it did little to ease the deeper worry gnawing at her chest. She continued her work, tending to warrior after warrior as the night wore on, the sounds of confrontation gradually shifting further from the den's walls, as Kale's forces pushed the intruders back toward the border. Then, just as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the horizon, a commotion arose near the courtyard's entrance. Illyra looked up to see a group of warriors carrying someone between them, their expressions grim with urgency. Her heart stopped when she recognized the golden hair and broad shoulders of the figure they carried. "Kale," she cried, rushing forward immediately, her training taking over, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. They laid him carefully on one of the makeshift cots, and Illyra's hands moved instinctively, assessing the injury along his side with practiced precision, though her heart pounded with a fear far more personal than any wound she had treated before. He took a hit protecting one of the younger warriors, Colton explained, his expression tense with worry. He wouldn't let anyone tend to it until the line was secure. Of course he wouldn't, Illyra muttered, focusing entirely on stemming the bleeding, her hands steady, despite the trembling fear beneath her calm exterior. Kale's eyes fluttered open, finding hers immediately, despite the pain evident in his expression. "You weren't supposed to be out here," he murmured weakly. "And you weren't supposed to get yourself hurt," she replied, though her voice carried more relief than reprimand, as she continued working on his wound. "The threat's been pushed back," he said, wincing as she applied pressure to the injury. "The Shadowfang retreated once they realized we were too well prepared for their ambush." "Save your strength," she instructed gently. You can explain everything once I've properly treated this wound. He obeyed, though his eyes never left her face as she worked. Something soft and grateful reflected in his gaze, despite the pain he was clearly enduring. Around them, the courtyard slowly began to settle, as warriors returned from the border, exhausted but triumphant, the immediate threat successfully repelled. By the time the sun fully rose over the territory, Cale's wound had been properly cleaned and bandaged, and Alira allowed herself a small measure of relief as she watched him rest, his breathing steady, despite the lingering pain evident in his expression. "You saved my life," he said quietly, once the courtyard had cleared enough to allow them a moment of privacy. "You saved plenty of others tonight," she replied, gently brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I simply made sure you were here to see the results of your efforts." He caught her hand, pressing a gentle kiss against her palm, the gesture carrying a tenderness that made her breath catch, despite the exhaustion weighing on them both. "I meant what I said last night, Alira. I love you, more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone." "I know," she said softly, smiling despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I love you too, Cale, completely, and without any doubts left between us." As the morning light spilled across the courtyard, illuminating the aftermath of the night's confrontation, Alira allowed herself to believe, for the first time in months, that the walls separating them had finally, fully come down. The Shadowfang threat had been pushed back, at least for now, and the truth between them had finally been spoken and claimed. But even as relief settled over the territory, a messenger arrived at the den's gates, bearing word from Draven's territory that would soon reveal just how far the danger surrounding their fated bond truly extended, and how much further they would still need to go before they could claim any lasting peace. The messenger, a weary young woman named Talia, arrived bearing a letter sealed with Draven's personal mark. Cale, still recovering from his wound but insistent on receiving the news himself, called Alira to his side as he broke the seal and read the contents carefully. His expression darkened with each line, and by the time he finished, his jaw had tightened with barely restrained anger. "What does it say?" Alira asked, watching him carefully. "Draven writes that the Shadowfang faction has grown bolder within his own territory," Cale explained, setting the letter down with visible frustration. "Their leader, a wolf named Garrick, has openly challenged Draven's authority, gathering enough support among discontented pack members to threaten a full uprising. Draven believes Garrick orchestrated the attack on our border deliberately, hoping to weaken our alliance before it could be solidified." "What does he propose we do?" Alira asked. "He's requesting a meeting," Cale said, "between the three of us, to discuss a unified strategy against Garrick's faction before the situation escalates further." Alira considered this carefully, aware of the risks involved in traveling to a meeting so soon after the attack, yet understanding the necessity of addressing the growing threat directly. "Do you trust him?" "I trust that our interests currently align," Cale said carefully. "Garrick's ambitions threaten us both. Whether Draven's motives extend beyond simple self-interest, I honestly cannot say with certainty, but for now, cooperation seems our wisest course." Despite his lingering injury, Cale insisted on attending the meeting personally, accompanied by a small group of trusted warriors, along with Alira, whose safety he refused to leave unguarded, given the recent threat against her specifically. They traveled to a neutral location along the border between their territories, a quiet clearing chosen for its accessibility to both packs. Draven arrived shortly after them, his expression uncharacteristically serious, stripped of the playful charm Alira had grown accustomed to seeing. "Garrick has grown far more dangerous than I initially believed," Draven admitted once formal greetings had been exchanged. "He's convinced a significant portion of my territory that our proposed alliance threatens their independence, that a unified front between our packs would ultimately lead to the Shadowfang faction being absorbed or eliminated entirely." "Is that his true concern, or simply a convenient excuse to seize power for himself?" Cale asked pointedly. "Likely both," Draven admitted. "Garrick has ambitions of his own, certainly, but fear can be a powerful tool for gathering support, whether or not the fear itself holds any real substance." The three of them spent hours discussing strategy, weighing options for addressing Garrick's growing influence without escalating the conflict into open, widespread violence between their territories. Elira listened carefully, occasionally offering insight from her own experiences within Kale's pack, her perspective as someone who had witnessed the transformation of both leaders proving valuable to the discussion. Perhaps, she suggested at one point, the solution lies not in confrontation, but in demonstrating unity so clearly that Garrick's claims lose their power entirely. If both packs openly stand together, supporting each other visibly and consistently, his fear-based arguments become far less convincing. Kale and Draven exchanged a thoughtful glance, considering her suggestion carefully. A formal alliance, Draven said slowly, publicly announced and celebrated, might indeed undermine Garrick's influence more effectively than any direct confrontation. It would also mean formally acknowledging the fated bond, Kale added, glancing toward Elira with a question evident in his eyes. Elira met his gaze steadily, understanding the weight of what he was asking. Formally claiming the bond publicly would eliminate any remaining ambiguity, solidifying their connection in a way that could not be denied or manipulated by those who wished to see it broken. "I'm ready," she said simply, and the certainty in her voice left no room for doubt. Draven watched the exchange with an expression that carried genuine warmth despite his earlier calculating nature. "Then let us plan a gathering, one that demonstrates unity so clearly that Garrick's faction finds itself with no fear left to exploit." Over the following days, preparations began for a formal celebration, one that would bring together both territories in a public display of alliance and unity. Word spread quickly throughout both packs, and despite the underlying tension caused by Garrick's growing rebellion, excitement began to build among those who welcomed the prospect of lasting peace between the two territories. Elira found herself swept into preparations she had never imagined being part of, fittings for ceremonial attire, discussions of tradition and protocol surrounding the formal acknowledgement of a fated bond, and quiet moments with Kale, where they discussed what this new chapter of their lives might truly mean. "Are you nervous?" Kale asked one evening, as they sat together on the same balcony where he had first begun to open up to her, weeks before. "A little," Elira admitted. "This is all still so new to me. A few months ago, I was simply a healer, trying to rebuild my life, after losing everything. Now I'm about to become, what, exactly? A queen? A partner," Kale corrected gently. "An equal, standing beside me, not beneath me. Whatever title the pack chooses to give you, that is the truth I intend to honor, always." Elira smiled, warmth spreading through her chest at his words. "I like that much better than queen." He pulled her close, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge across the darkening sky. Despite the looming threat of Garrick's rebellion, despite the uncertainty of what challenges still lay ahead, Elira felt a deep sense of peace settle over her, a certainty that whatever came next, she would face it standing beside the man she had grown to love completely, no longer separated by secrets or unspoken fears. The formal celebration would take place within the week, and though Garrick's faction still loomed as a threat on the horizon, Elira found herself looking forward to the future, with a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the night her village had burned. Whatever trials still awaited them, she was ready to face them, not as a frightened healer clinging to survival, but as a woman who had finally found a place, and a love, worth fighting for. The day of the formal celebration arrived beneath a clear autumn sky, the territory transformed with banners and flowers, warriors from both packs mingling freely for the first time, without the tension that had once defined their interactions. Elira stood in a quiet chamber, dressed in a gown of deep forest green, her hands trembling slightly, as Ines helped secure the final details of her appearance. "You look beautiful," Ines said warmly, stepping back to admire her work. "Kale won't be able to take his eyes off you." "I'm terrified," Elira admitted, studying her reflection in the polished mirror before her. "So much rests on today. If this doesn't convince Garrick's faction to stand down, if this only provokes them further, then you and Kale will face it together, as you have faced everything else," Ines said gently. "But today is not about fear, Elira. Today is about celebrating what you've both fought so hard to build. Let yourself feel joy, even amid the uncertainty." Elira took a steadying breath, allowing Ines's words to settle over her. She thought of everything that had led her to this moment, the fire that had taken her village, the year of confusion and unspoken tension with Kale, the slow, careful unraveling of truth that had finally brought them here. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, she refused to let fear overshadow the significance of what they had built together. When she finally emerged into the courtyard where the ceremony would take place, she found Cale waiting for her, dressed in formal attire that emphasized his commanding presence, though his eyes softened the moment he saw her approaching. "You look incredible," he said softly, taking her hand as she reached him. "You clean up rather nicely yourself," she teased, earning a rare, genuine smile from him. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, a public acknowledgement of the fated bond between them, witnessed by members of both territories gathered in the courtyard. Draven stood among the honored guests, his expression carrying genuine warmth as he watched the proceedings unfold. As Cale spoke the traditional words acknowledging Alira as his fated mate, his voice carried clearly across the gathered crowd, steady and certain despite the weight of the moment. "Before this pack, and before the alliance we now build together, I claim Alira as my mate, not because fate demanded it, but because I choose her, completely and without reservation, for as long as I live." Alira's eyes filled with tears as she spoke her own vow in return, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "I choose you as well, Cale Ashgrove, not as the Alpha King, but as the man who showed me, even through his fears and mistakes, what it truly means to be loved and protected. I choose this life, and this bond, freely and completely." The crowd erupted into celebration as the ceremony concluded, warriors from both territories, cheering together in a display of unity that seemed to finally, fully bridge the divide that had once separated them. Alira caught Draven's eye across the courtyard, and he offered her a genuine respectful nod, acknowledging the significance of what had been accomplished. As the celebration continued into the evening, filled with music and laughter and the warm glow of unity between two territories, word arrived that would soon test the strength of everything they had built. A rider approached the gathering, breathless from hard travel, bearing urgent news from the border. "Garrick's forces are retreating," the rider announced, once he had caught his breath enough to speak clearly. "Word of the alliance and the formal claiming has spread through the Shadowfang ranks. Many of Garrick's supporters have abandoned his cause, refusing to fight against a unity so clearly and publicly celebrated." Relief swept through the gathered crowd, cheers erupting once more as the news settled over them. Alira turned to Cale, joy and disbelief mingling in her expression. "It worked. It worked because of you," Cale said softly, pulling her close, despite the celebration continuing around them. "Your idea, your courage, in standing beside me despite the danger, that's what turned the tide, Alira. Not simply the alliance itself, but the truth and strength behind it." She smiled up at him, her heart full with a happiness she had never imagined possible after the darkness that had once defined her life. "We did this together, Cale, all of it." As the celebration stretched late into the night, Alira found herself reflecting on the long, complicated journey that had brought her to this moment. The confusion and hurt of Cale's unexplained anger, the slow unraveling of truth, the danger they had faced together, and the deep, unshakable love that had grown from all of it. Every difficult moment, every unanswered question, had led her here, to a life and a love she had never imagined finding, after losing everything she once knew. Draven approached them as the night wound down, offering a respectful bow before speaking. "I believe congratulations are in order," he said, genuine warmth coloring his voice, despite the complicated history between them. "And perhaps an apology for the games I played during my earlier visits." "Your warning about Garrick likely saved lives," Cale acknowledged. "Whatever games came before, that debt remains between us." Draven nodded, a small, satisfied smile crossing his features. "Then let us hope this alliance marks the beginning of lasting peace between our territories, rather than merely a temporary solution to a shared threat." "I believe it will," Alira said confidently, looking up at Cale with a certainty that came from everything they had overcome together. "We've built something real here, something worth protecting." As the final guests began departing, and the territory settled into peaceful quiet once more, Cale led Alira away from the lingering celebration, toward the same balcony where so much of their story had unfolded. They stood together beneath the stars, the weight of the day's significance settling comfortably over them both. "Any regrets?" Cale asked softly, studying her profile in the moonlight. "None," Elira answered immediately, turning to face him fully. Every difficult moment led us here. To this. I wouldn't change a single part of our story, Kale. Not even the parts that hurt. He pulled her close, pressing a gentle kiss against her forehead. Then let's make sure the rest of our story is one worth telling. Together, for the rest of our lives. As they stood together beneath the vast, star-filled sky, the Alpha King who had once hated everyone who came near her, now stood beside her freely, openly, no longer guarding a painful secret, but celebrating a love finally spoken, claimed, and fully embraced. Whatever challenges the future still held, Elira knew with unwavering certainty that she would face them exactly where she belonged, standing beside the man who had chosen her, completely and without reservation, for the rest of their lives.